law, political science, and English, women's studies programs, African American studies, the Black Student Alliance, Ames, ISU, YMCA, the Margaret Sloss Women's Center, the Dean of Students, Minority Student Affairs, Office of the Provost, Delta Sigma Theta, and the Committee on Lectures. In addition to these groups that are supporting the lecture, the lecture series is supported with a grant from the Iowa Humanities Board and, of course, funded by the GSB. The purpose of this lecture series is to examine the issues of race and gender and how they intersect throughout the history, particularly in the women's suffrage campaign. And Dr. Rosalyn Terborg-Penn, who's the second speaker in this lecture series, is widely recognized as the nation's leading authority on the role of African American women in the suffrage movement. She's a professor of history at Morgan State University, which is in Baltimore, Maryland, where she's also the director of the Graduate Studies program. And she has written extensively about the role of African Americans in the struggle for women's suffrage, beginning with her dissertation in 1977 from Howard University. Her books include The African American Woman, Struggles and Images, which was first published in 1978 and is being reissued this year. And there's some flyers about that in the back. Also, she's written a book on Black Women in America, a historical encyclopedia, and she's the author of numerous scholarly studies on Black feminists, African feminists, and African American families. She has appeared on several PBS documentaries on Ida B. Wells and also One Woman, One Vote. And she currently is working on 3 books, all of which should be published sometime this year, including, I think, a long-awaited and updated book on her dissertation on Afro-Americans in the struggle for women's suffrage. Please join me with welcoming Dr. Rosalyn Terborg-Penn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was kind country. I had a pleasant trip today. The pilot said, oh, it's cold. It's about 48 degrees. And you know, those of us who come from Maryland, that's a little chilly. But maybe it's 48 now, but it must have been about 60 when I got here. It felt very comfortable. Good trip, sun is shining. People have been very nice, so I'm very happy to be here. Now, my sinuses are acting up. So if I stop and have to drink some water, it's because they're kicking me, okay? So that's why I'm sucking on this to get myself warmed up here. I've been working on this, as Diane has said, for over 20 years. I hate to admit it, but I came upon this topic years ago, and I realized it was now shortly after the 50th anniversary of the Women's Suffrage Amendment, which was ratified when? 1920. So last year we celebrated the 75th anniversary. So for me to say I came upon this shortly after we celebrated the 50th is revealing, to say the least. But I started graduate school in 1972 at Howard, and I went specifically to do something on women, Black women. But I didn't know what I was going to do. And in writing some papers, I came upon just the idea of women reformers, women's rights. And one of my professors said, well, you know, you can't do a dissertation on women's rights. That's too broad. You have to narrow it. So naively, I narrowed it to women's suffrage, not thinking that it was going to, you know, be an over 70-year period that I would be studying, and that there was a lot of digging to be done. But the reason I was attracted to it was the literature that was out in the late 60s, early 70s. Aside from, in fact, I wasn't even familiar with Eileen Creditor's book on the ideas of the women's suffrage movement, but just articles and things that had come out of the women's movement in the late 60s gave me the impression that Black men didn't like the idea of suffrage, were anti-women's suffrage, and that Black women were indifferent to it. Well, at Howard, I was finding other things. I read Frederick Douglass and the Women's Movement that Benjamin Quarles had written in 1940. And in that study, he talked about Frederick Douglass and other black men who were abolitionists who were pro-women's suffrage and spoke in favor of women's suffrage. Then I was finding evidence of women, black women, who supported suffrage. So it came to my mind that there was a myth out there that for some reason, women scholars, women's history scholars, and others were saying that we were something we were not. So I set upon the task of proving that my theory was right and theirs was wrong. And I must pat myself on the back and say it took me a while, but I finally finished my dissertation in '77. It took me 5 years to finish everything. And I found that black men, for the most part, were publicly in favor of women's suffrage, more so than white men. And that black women had their own reasons for wanting suffrage that were often similar to those of other women, but also similar to those of men who were disfranchised. And I'm just going to give you a little piece of that today, because I couldn't possibly tell you the whole story or even summarize it in one session. The title of my talk today is African American Women Suffragists in the Booker T. Washington Era. And for those of you who are not historians, who might know the name Booker T. Washington but not know the era, let me give you some time frames here. It would be from about the 1890s to about 1915, beginning of World War I. Motives for women's political mobilization vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction across time. However, one of the motives to emerge is women's desire to improve the social conditions of people in their communities through political means. For black and white women 100 years ago, there were diverse motives for seeking the right to vote, emerging dramatically during what we call the Booker T. Washington era. African American women in their struggle for the vote attempted to strike a blow against the widening effects of white supremacy at the turn of the century. This was a high point in the institutionalization of white supremacy as an ideology, not just as a practice in the nation's history. For the most part, white women suffragists of the era were either oblivious to the plight of African American women or participated in the institutionalization of white supremacy. Nevertheless, women's strategies for political mobilization during this period did not vary significantly in relationship to race. Although their reasons for becoming suffragists may have varied, black and white women sought to organize in clubs and unions to provide both social and political vehicles for personal and community development. Women's suffrage as a political movement among primarily middle-class women reformers in the northeastern region of the nation reshaped in the 1890s with the unification of two feuding suffrage associations. With the birth of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which we will call the NAWSA, women suffragists developed a broader agenda. Suffragists recruited Southern women in particular, for in this region, the women's suffrage movement had suffered the greatest losses as state legislatures feared female empowerment generally and the political mobilization of African American women in particular. For many African American women, obtaining the right to vote was a survival strategy. These women believed that once the people in their networks obtained the right to suffrage, they could use the ballot as a means to fight the disfranchisement of Southern black men and to bring other reforms needed in their communities nationwide. Consequently, political mobilization was needed for Black empowerment, both inside and outside of the South. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, African American women suffragists gave special attention to social reform and looked to the ballot box as a means to that end. Many Black women believed, I know this is naive, but believed that good citizens were obligated to protect their communities. Because of this view, the drive to join social and political reforms with the women's suffrage movement became a major strategy implemented by African American women. They called for the ballot to improve educational facilities for the race as a whole and for Black women in particular. They argued further that the effective use of the vote could also improve conditions in their communities. Most of the Black women suffragists networked with other women of their race to form organizations to assist them in obtaining social and political goals. Although many of the suffragists formed coalitions with white women or with African American men, self-reliance through female networks was always apparent, especially during the last 2 decades of the women's suffrage campaign from 1900 to 1920. In local as well as national organizations, leadership was elected. Women leaders were selected because of their accomplishments or their ability to compromise in order to unite groups of women with differing strategies for meeting goals. Leaders were selected also because of their status as women of note in their communities. Women suffrage leaders were primarily from the educated middle class, the elite among Black people of this era, but also from the working classes as well. Evidence of coalitions between African American women's organizations and white women's suffragists appeared in the 4th volume of The History of Women's Suffrage, edited in 1900 by Susan B. Anthony. In her directory of women's organizations, she included brief institutional sketches and information written by representatives of the organization. Only one listing represented African American women. Significantly, it was the National Association of Colored Women, and Margaret Murray Washington represented the association as the editor of the newsletter and the author of the institutional sketch listed in the directory. Now, you know who Margaret Murray Washington was. Guess, figure it out. This Booker T. Washington's wife, okay? And in addition to the directory, Anthony included lists of prominent Americans who supported women's suffrage. She included both Booker T. Washington and Margaret Murray Washington in this directory. The Washingtons courted white reformers such as Susan B. Anthony, who visited Tuskegee and donated funds to the institution. As quietly as it was kept, this coalition of middle-class Black and white reformers supported mutually beneficial movements such as African American institutional development and the women's suffrage movement. Now, there is still a myth that Booker T. Washington was against women's suffrage. You know, I've said it, I've written it, but people still say that he didn't support it, and as a result, his wife wasn't interested. But of course, I found evidence that does not support that myth or that contention. Journalist and educator Gertrude Bustelle Moselle represented middle-class Black womanhood also. A Pennsylvania native, she was one of the first African American women to publish a book that made the connection between women's suffrage and its potential influence in improving educational opportunities. In addition, she viewed suffrage as a major strategy for implementing social reform. At the turn of the century, she acknowledged the many women leaders in her network, women who had made strides towards self and group improvement. She also assessed women's suffrage as a movement which could be used as leverage for further racial uplift. Moselle dramatized the urgency for reform in Black communities and encouraged the women of her race to seek training in professions such as journalism, not limiting themselves to gender conventions prescribed for them by the wider society. During the first decade of the new century, a significant network of African American women had developed with professional leaders like Margaret Murray Washington, who were in the vanguard of the Black women's suffrage movement. Educator Mary Church Terrell, who in 1896 had been elected the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, was one such leader. Tennessee-born and educated, she settled in the District of Columbia. Like Moselle, Terrell connected the exercise of suffrage with efforts to reform society and expand opportunities for women of her race. In 1910, she warned a group of Howard University women students that without political power, effective reform would be difficult to accomplish. Terrell and Washington were among several Southern club leaders and suffragists. Sylvainy Williams of New Orleans was another. In 1903, when the NAWSA met in New Orleans, Susan B. Anthony visited the Black Phyllis Wheatley Club in the city. In presenting flowers to Anthony on the occasion, Sylvainy Williams, president of the club, indicated that Black women were painfully aware of their, quote, downtrodden, unquote, position among white suffragists. She asserted, nonetheless, that Black club women in her city would continue to press to be included in the women's suffrage amendment despite the attempts to keep them out. For Southern Black women, the women's suffrage strategy went far beyond the goal of reforming Black communities. For overt racial prejudice must be attacked as the first political goal. Prominent Black club women who were suffragists also came from the Midwest. In 1915, Elizabeth Lindsay Davis, national organizer for the National Association of Colored Women, argued that only through the ballot could philanthropy be accomplished successfully. An Ohio native, she noted that women of her race were pioneers in reform movements. Like Washington, Moselle, and Terrell, women in her network, Davis was a woman married to a professional man, yet she worked in paid jobs to supplement her income and performed unpaid political work for the race. An active organizer for the NACW, Lindsay was paid for her work as a clubwoman, but had begun her activism as a volunteer worker in Chicago, where she helped to find lodging and protection for Southern women migrating to the city in search of domestic work. As a national organizer, she urged those women of her race who already had the ballot to put it to good use. As suffrage became a reality for women living in selected states outside of the South, the use of the ballot to promote educational and economic reform became evident, especially among African American women who worked full-time in professional and laboring positions. Although the majority of Black women in the U.S. lived in the South, others lived in states where limited or full suffrage had been legislated before the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchised all women in 1920. For example, Maria Baldwin, an NACW member and a principal of a public school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, reported how important even the limits of school suffrage were in her state. There, Baldwin noted how women's votes had kept local schools from the control of politicians who threatened the survival of good school policies. A single woman, Baldwin was the sole provider for her economic support. The road to self-sufficiency had not been easy, however. As a trained educator living in Massachusetts, she could not find a teaching job there because of her color. As a result, her first job was in a segregated school in rural Maryland. Later, with the help of politically connected African American men in Massachusetts, She was able to win a position as a teacher and later promoted to principal of the Agassiz School in Cambridge. White supremacy by the early 20th century was alive and institutionalized throughout the nation, as you can see. Nonetheless, African American women sought to overcome the veil of discrimination and prejudice through political mobilization. In New York State, women gained full suffrage in 1917, becoming the first state east of the Mississippi River to legislate so. African American women played prominent roles in obtaining the victory. Working class women such as Lena M. Johnson represented working class women who had lobbied for the vote as early as 1915, when a New York State referendum first went before the male voters. As the district grand most noble governor of the household of Ruth, Johnson led this Masonic order of women affiliated with the Grand United Order of Oddfellows. Now that's the black Oddfellows. You know, there's a black one and there's a white one. In 1915, her organization met for a statewide Masonic convention in Poughkeepsie, New York. The women composed a petition signed by Johnson in behalf of the order to go to the New York Women's Suffrage Party in support of a state women's suffrage referendum. The petition argued that, quote, "The women of our race are largely wage earners in industry and their labors need the protection of the ballot," unquote. This petition made clear that working class as middle class black women supported women's suffrage for reasons characteristic of their social and economic status. Johnson, like Baldwin, was a full-time paid worker, although they differed in class. Nonetheless, they shared sentiments about the importance of political empowerment for working women. The New York State Women's Suffrage Campaign included many working class women and their organizations, a critical mass significant enough to temper the class biases of middle-class suffragists. Not only were 75,000 African American women enfranchised by the 1917 New York legislation, but the first black representative to the New York State Assembly, as representatives to the Assembly, were elected with the help of black female voters. The following year, Gertrude E. Curtis and Laura B. Fisher were elected to the New York State Republican Convention, the political party of choice for most African Americans during the early 20th century. The election of these women to one of the two major political party state conventions revealed only one aspect of the degree of political mobilization among African American women. Those who were organized into networks such as the NACW or the Black Women's Republican Party clubs found throughout the North mobilized to put political pressure for reform upon politicians who controlled the quality of life in black communities. In New York State particularly, hundreds of grassroots and professional black women joined church and lay organizations, the primary goals of which were to uplift the race and to circumvent white supremacy. The discourse of racial uplift was heard in both male and female circles during the early 20th century. Perhaps its meaning differed depending on gender and class. One thing is certain, however, the reality of white supremacy was felt nationwide for African Americans regardless of class or gender. Consequently, strategies for suffrage crossed boundaries of gender conventions among people of African descent, as white Americans implemented strategies to keep all blacks from the polls. By the end of the Booker T. Washington era in 1915, African American men such as W.E.B. Du Bois used various methods to mobilize the race to support women's suffrage. Although Booker T. Washington had quietly supported the idea of women's suffrage, he could not make the movement a cause to advocate in a national arena, just as he could not publicly push for the re-enfranchisement of black men in the South. Du Bois, on the other hand, used his position as editor of the NAACP's The Crisis magazine to create forums for men and women to espouse their support for the enfranchisement of African American women. It was in The Crisis where subscribers read Maria Baldwin's views about the positive effect of women's voting in school elections. In 1912, Du Bois also published an article by Tuskegee's own Adela Hunt Logan, who militantly supported women's suffrage because she believed it was her right as a citizen to vote. From a practical standpoint, however, Logan argued that in Western states, where women won the right to vote, they had reformed their communities and protected Black families from social and criminal ills. In calling for prominent Black leaders, both men and women like Logan spoke out for suffrage. Du Bois stimulated the idea of political empowerment, for he always connected women's suffrage for Black women as a means to fight white supremacy and to help enfranchise Black men in the South, who lost their right to vote during the last decade of the 19th century. As Logan indicated, when given the opportunity, Black women in the West exercised the right to vote. For instance, they had voted in Colorado at the turn of the century, where Elizabeth Piper Ensley of Denver was a main spokeswoman for Black club women and women's suffrage. Their political activists were noted by Helen Woodbury, who in 1909 published a study of the equal suffrage movement in Colorado. Woodbury commented that Black women were interested in politics because in 1901 there was a, quote, colored, quote, Republican club, colored women's club in Denver. From Woodbury's overall statistics, she concluded that a larger percentage of Black women than white women voted in the 1906 Denver election. Needless to say, reports like Woodbury's sent up red flags in front of those who feared the potential power of Black women voters, especially the power of African American club women. Woodbury's findings are not surprising because the women's club movement had expanded dramatically. For the most part, these clubs also developed along racially separate lines. Perhaps one reason for this separate development lay in the unique needs of Black women during the period. White women did not have the severe problems of racial discrimination, which compounded the Black women's plight in employment and education. Moreover, race consciousness was evident among African American women in general, as growing numbers of race-specific civil rights organizations, business groups, and self-help societies emerged in the early years of the 20th century. Another reason, however, for the development of racially separate groups during the Booker T. Washington era was the exclusion of Black women from most white women's clubs. Despite the differences between the two groups, there were some Black women who were determined to enter the mainstream. The negative experiences of many of their leaders, however, indicated the pervasiveness of white female prejudice and discrimination against Black females in women's groups, even those who were part of the women's suffrage coalition. There was a nationwide, not just a Southern prejudice against African American women. It appears that white women outside of the South used Southern white women's overt prejudice as an excuse for the NAWSA's discriminatory policies, while hiding their similar feelings about African American women, although they shared many of the Black women's goals for reform and women's political equity. African American women suffragists were quite aware of their position, and they were determined to move beyond the attempts to keep them disfranchised. Black suffragists knew that although those national suffrage leaders who courted Black support endorsed equal suffrage among the race while in African American circles, their public actions and statements to the mainstream society often contradicted their professional egalitarianism. For example, Alice Paul, organizer of the National Women's Party and the suffrage parade in front of the White House in 1913, had expressed her sympathy for black women's enfranchisement. So also had Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the NAWSA. Yet before the parade, the suffrage leaders asked Ida B. Wells Barnett, who represented the Alpha Suffrage Club, a group of over 60 African American suffragists, not to march with the white Chicago delegates for fear of offending white Southern women and alienating them from the suffrage cause. As the Booker T. Washington era ended with his death in 1915, African American women continued to challenge attempts to keep them from participating in the women's suffrage movement and efforts to keep them from being included in what was popularly called the Susan B. Anthony Amendments, congressional legislation. 5 years later, however, the success or failure of the amendment was too close to call, as states considered approving the amendment in their legislatures. At this juncture, the National Women's Suffrage leadership needed every vote, including those of the black men outside of the South who had not been disfranchised. As often happens, African American voters hold the key to the balance of political power at the polls. By a narrow margin, in fact, one vote in the Tennessee legislature, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment became the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which enfranchised for a brief period all American women, including black ones. Perseverance and organizational mobilization was the key to African American victory, although the enfranchisement of all African American women was short-lived because within less than a decade, the women in the South, where most of them lived, lost the vote, as their men had. In closing, let me comment about the right to vote as an idea or a concept. The history of suffrage movements in the United States involves the quest of disfranchised men and women for the right to make political choices. In so doing, they hope that the choices will give them a voice in the government decision-making process. Throughout suffrage history in the United States, the quest for the right to the ballot has pitted the power brokers against the powerless. More often than not, the powerless have had to be awakened to the potential of their voting power. Once awakened, historically, their desire for political equity was stimulated. This process connected African American women suffragists to the same path that other groups had followed and would later follow: propertyless white men, African American men, non-educated persons, white women, Native Americans, and young people. The process varied from group to group, determined by the effort needed to awaken members of their political lethargy and the barriers placed in the way of their enfranchisement. In the case of the majority of black women, slavery, illiteracy, poverty, and gender proscription provided significant barriers to thwart group political awakening. Such a combination of barriers and multiple forms of oppression rarely limited the development of political acumen among other suffrage-seeking groups. As a result of the many barriers, it should not be surprising that the majority of African American women who argued in behalf of women's suffrage were educated women from the so-called middle class. However, the first known black female suffragist, Sojourner Truth, was illiterate and from the working class. We may never know how many working-class African American women struggled for the right to vote during the years of the women's suffrage movement. We do know that within time, more and more working class black women advocated women's suffrage and actively participated in the movement. Once African American women became aware of suffrage as a prize worth seeking, they began the path to the suffrage goal. However, there were two major forks in this path that other groups did not share. One was the branch women took, which was a protracted road to the ballot box. Women, more so than men, have had to struggle longer on the suffrage path to reach the prize. In this sense, all women shared the same historical experience. Nonetheless, white women, even those of the working class, did not have to contend with the double burden of racial and gender discrimination as barriers to their right to vote. The second fork came once the enfranchisement had been achieved. Some women kept it, but others could not. On this path, black men and black women share the sojourn. In contextualizing their experiences, we can say that race was a social construct invented by people of European descent to achieve the hegemonic goals necessary to dominate people of color throughout the world during the 19th century. Let me repeat, race was constructed, okay, for the most part in the 19th century. As a consequence of this reality, some say today that race does not exist. Although biologically there is no such thing as race, we can still argue that racism exists at the time race was socially constructed and continue to exist during the political struggles for suffrage rights of black women and black men. Racism will continue to exist in the United States until it's sufficiently eliminated as an ideology and as a practice. I thank you.
We have some time for some questions, and then there'll be a reception following, and then some interaction with Dr. Terborg-Penn then. Any questions?
Speechless.
Yes.
I'm sure you've got researched many stories. Could you share some highlights of what moved you by these women's stories for action?
Well, the most recent one, he asked, the stories that I've heard in researching this, and I talked about this several times today, but some of you might have remembered when Nell Painter came here last, was it January or February, to talk about her new book on Sojourner Truth. And that has been very unraveling to me. I mean, how what we know about Sojourner Truth in the suffrage movement is really nothing, because what was said about her was constructed for the most part. And so that amazes me. But I guess this is true with almost any subaltern group. I mean, unless your voice is heard, if you're illiterate, you can't write your story. Even if you tell your story, whoever writes it can write what they want, and you have no way of verifying whether they're writing what you want them to write. So that has been perhaps my most interesting story to tell at this point. Another recent thing that I found out was, and I think some of you might, I don't know, this isn't a Northeastern crowd, so they might not find this very interesting, but during the suffrage movement in New York City, Thomas Dewey, anybody know who Thomas Dewey is? Everybody over a certain age, I've noticed. Okay, Thomas Dewey is the man who ran for president against Harry Truman. And what was it? I don't know which New York paper printed. Dewey won, and in reality, Truman had won. But Thomas Dewey was a progressive Republican, I would say, in the 30s and the 40s, and really earlier. But he was a professor, I believe, at either Columbia or NYU in the teens, and his wife was a suffragist. And it was her responsibility for mobilizing the women in her district to come out and to participate and to become active. And this was in 1910. She decided that since part of her district overlapped into Little Africa, which I'm sure was Harlem, but that's what the press called it, Little Africa. And they could have been either I think they were probably in Columbia, which would have been going up towards Harlem. And so she set out and talked to some women in some churches and some professional organizations, and she got them interested in having a meeting. And she brought Mary Church Terrell down from Washington, and they were going to address this group. And apparently they had a large apartment in a nice building in Manhattan. When the word got out in the apartment building that she was going to bring these colored women to their elite apartment house, the neighbors organized, got a lawyer, and they got an injunction to keep the Deweys from entertaining these black women in their home. So, but it made the papers, and I thought it was interesting. Now, that didn't stop them. Of course, others went on, and they organized in more public places where they couldn't bar them. But, I'm from New York, so I'm not surprised. But people assumed that all this segregation and attempts to keep people barred was a Southern phenomenon, but it wasn't a Southern phenomenon. It was a national phenomenon. And the Deweys were really criticized quite a bit for this. Now, it's at this point when blacks are very heavily Republican. And I'm sure one of the reasons that the Deweys sought these black women was so that they could convert their husbands to support the issues that the Deweys were supporting. And of course, it's all political. But to just invite them to your house is a major step. I don't think they anticipated, though, this response from their elite neighbors who, they didn't think would probably even notice. And they weren't having 1,000 people. I mean, maybe 40 or 50. I mean, it wasn't this huge mass meeting that they were having at the house. So that was a very interesting story that I just discovered recently and will be in my book.
Once the 19th Amendment was passed, I'm wondering about the continuing activities of the Negro women in the suffrage movement or efforts to bring fuller rights to all women. Did your research lead you to investigate what they did once the 19th Amendment and universal suffrage was achieved?
Well, two things were happening. Almost as soon as the 19th Amendment was ratified, and it was 1920, that's a presidential election. And for those of you who didn't know, Warren G. Harding was running and won. And one of the reasons he won was not because he was handsome. That's the story I was told, And that women were voting and they couldn't help it. They voted for this and that. He campaigned for women's suffrage. He also campaigned in black clubs. I mean, I have found records of we got a telegram from Harding asking us to endorse the platform. And the women are debating, well, the lynching segment is just a splinter and we can't quite endorse the platform. We can endorse him. And they endorsed him, so the NACW endorsed him, but not the platform because they didn't think it was strong enough. So I found evidences of club women in particular working in the campaigns. Nannie Helen Burroughs was the president of the Washington, D.C. Black Republican, or I don't know if it was black or Negro or colored, but some variation on that, Republican Women's Club. Now, nobody in the District of Columbia could vote. So it's interesting to me that there would be political clubs, but Mary Church Terrell had come out of that same club. And during the 1920 election, she was elected the coordinator of colored Republican women for the Northeast. So she ended up in New York City at Republican campaign headquarters working on the election. And there were several black women in various parts of the nation who were tapped to do this. And most of them were club women who had a network. And I'm assuming that the strategy was to get these women not only to vote themselves, but to get the men in their networks to vote also. And as I said before, a lot of times the black vote was the swing vote. If black voters came out, I mean, this is how John F. Kennedy won in '60, as quietly as that's kept. But a lot of times politicians understand that particular groups, regardless of whether it's racial or gender groups, and they're talking about this in the election now. What is it, the soccer moms? Oh, good grief, the soccer moms of the swing vote. You know, I'm saying, you know, that's so important. But I mean, but is that true? Is it you're a soccer? You don't know, huh? But this is the idea that, you know, educated middle class women who live in